Morning, everybody. Hope you all got some sleep last night. I was in Finland yesterday, speaking at a legal conference as well, funnily enough. Pardon? Hyvä päivä. And I wasn't speaking in Finnish. And it was very interesting talking to the lawyers there yesterday during the conference and talking about actually the space project that I've been working on. I'd done the speech and they were coming up afterwards and asking questions over the coffee break. And a lot of the people there thought about the issue of space because some of them were actually lawyers who worked in that area, and they thought of it very much in the terms of the industry that they saw, which was basically launching satellites for commercial clients into space and how to legally get the insurance worked out, and the insurance was the biggest issue for them. None of them had ever really thought about space launch itself and why it costs 10% of every satellite's cost to go into space to insure it and do the legals on it. So if you're looking at the aviation industry, for example, the insurance and the legals around the aviation industry are about 0.5% of the costs of taking customers around the world to various destinations or taking freight. In terms of space, it's 10% of the cost is spent. And the legal bills are huge for launching a satellite, the insurance bills are huge. And all of that is because space has been a government monopoly for 60 years. Since the end of the Second World War, when Wernher von Braun, having successfully tested his rocket on London, was captured by the US and started to build rockets to take people to space, and the Russians were doing the same thing, and then the Chinese got into the game, they built ever bigger V2s. And there has never been any change to that in 65 years. All the technology that we've developed has been in space in terms of the satellites, the things we do up there. There's been no technological development of the method of access to space, which is why there's never been an industrial revolution in space. What I'm going to be talking about today is the world's first commercial space project. I'll tell you first of all about a little bit about the history of Virgin, and I'll tell you about how a company that started with Mike Oldfield and the Sex Pistols has ended up building the world's first commercial spaceship. There is a logic to that somewhere, and I'll try and get to it. But before I do that, I am going to show you Grown, a very short video. And the reason for that is that a lot of people don't really believe that this project is happening. It's taken a long time to convince people it is actually possible to change the game and bring private sector money into the space industry on the scale that's happening right now. I'll be explaining during the speech how that's come about. But the reason I'll show you the film is, A, just to give you a flavour of the fact that this is a very real project. And secondly, because I was at a conference 3 years ago with Buzz Aldrin, and he hadn't shown a film about the space project before he did his speech. And at the end of it, during the Q&A with the journalists and the TV crews and all the rest of it, one Dennis Pennis, masquerading as a BBC journalist, came up and said, "Hey Buzz, you never went to space, it was all Capricorn 1, wasn't it?" Now, Dennis didn't realise that Buzz Aldrin was in fact the US Navy boxing champion in 1959. And he sent Dennis across about 3 rows of the conference stalls. And to avoid me having to do that with any of you today, I'm going to show you this short film before I start. Thank you.
The exploration of space will go ahead, and it is one of the great adventures of our time. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory on Mount Everest was asked why did he want to climb it. He said because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Virgin Galactic is on track to become the world's first commercial space line. And if you've ever dreamt of joining the incredible group of pioneering astronauts, your opportunity has arrived. During your adventure, you will accelerate to a breathtaking 3.5 times the speed of sound. Then, in the silent tranquility of space, you will experience weightlessness and views of our beautiful planet that will change your perception of life. A uniquely experienced and knowledgeable team of designers and engineers have come together to produce our beautiful Virgin Galactic spaceship, Enterprise, creating the best and safest possible experience for each and every astronaut. Our spaceship has been specifically designed with many large windows, allowing you to see over 1,000 miles in any direction. The spacious cabin will also maximize the out-of-seat, zero-gravity experience in a safe environment. Safety and customer experience are, after all, what Virgin's all about. Virgin's global transportation businesses have enjoyed formidable safety records, and Virgin Galactic will be no exception. After a thorough and exhaustive test flight program and FAA licensing, Virgin Galactic will be launched.
One of my passions or reason for wanting to fly in space is based on what these guys that do it say. And they don't say it just after flying. They talk about it for the rest of their lives, about wow, that was life-changing even. And I'm just tired of hearing it. I got to do it myself.
The rocket motor ride is a minute and a half or so, and it's exhilarating. It's like nothing else you've ever done. When that motor does shut down, the vibrations go away, and you get this instant karma of weightlessness. It's a thrill, and it all happens just like that. This black void that's space. It's a mystery, but you get a sense of its majesty as well. And separating these two extremes is this thin blue electric ribbon of light. That's the atmosphere. You cannot appreciate the experience just by looking at a magazine cover, just what it is like to take it in with your own eyes. And everything you feel in your body is the same way. It's wow.
Virgin Galactic's technology will not only be safe, it will also be clean. Our vehicles are constructed from light and strong carbon composite materials. The spaceship is released from the air, not launched from the ground, and is almost completely reusable. It has a hybrid rocket motor, which operates for only a short period and is completely free from toxic materials. The controlled glide back to the spaceport requires no fuel at all. The project has reached and passed many important milestones. We have a truly inspiring design for our home at Spaceport America in New Mexico. Our first Virgin Galactic astronauts are booking their own place in history as pioneers of a new space age, and for them, the journey has already started. I've had some incredible adventures in my lifetime, and space is sure to be the greatest one of all. I am going, and I hope you will be joining me.
Thank you. Well, so where's the lateral thinking in all of that? And how did it come from this? As you know, Virgin was started in the late 1960s by Sir Richard Branson. He was only a teenager at the time. He'd just left school. And the name itself was very interesting because it really, they thought of it one day. His cousin Simon Draper, a guy called Ken Berry, and himself thought of it one day because they'd come up with a name for a record company they were about to start because their student magazine had been very successful. And they were going to call the record company Slips Disc Records. And it happens to be true that Richard, and the name sounded quite sort of trendy, Slip Disc Records, but he said, well, I couldn't use that for other things. I mean, you couldn't call something Slip Disc Airlines, for example. And so he thought they should call it Virgin because they were all virgins in business. They'd never had any experience of business before. And it would be a really good trendy name for young people to develop all sorts of different businesses in the future. Now, that was a group of kids who were 18 years old in 1968, at a time when entrepreneurialism was not on the top of the agenda in the UK. This was the first logo of Virgin. It was used on Mike Oldfield Tubular Bells album. And quickly, the company morphed in different directions. One of the things that Richard thought of at that time was that he wanted to do other things. And if he was going to do other things, he shouldn't do them in the same company. He should separate out the companies. Now, these were people who had no experience of business, but the one thing he had experience of was the law. In the very foundations of Virgin, Richard had realized that you could export records in a van from Dover to Calais and then bring them back and not pay sales tax, which was the early version of VAT that the UK had before it entered the common market as it was. And he got done by Customs and Excise. And he learned his lesson at the age of 18. And therefore he always had very, very good lawyers. The first firm he worked with was Harbottle and Lewis, and they gave him the understanding of how to set up companies legally and structured in a way that very few young people of that generation would have had the chance to do. And it morphed into this. Following that model, which we developed over the succeeding years, I joined the firm just after the airline had started in 1984-5. And one of the reasons I joined was because I was a graduate trainee with Thomas Cook in 1984 when Virgin Atlantic started. And I experienced two things. The first thing I experienced was the BA person coming to see us at the Thomas Cook branch in Croydon, where I was doing my graduate training work on the counter of a travel office, trying to give us a £100 Marks and Spencer's voucher not to sell Virgin tickets. I proudly say I took the £100 Marks and Spencer's voucher because there was no audit trail, and therefore we all took the £100 Marks and Spencer's voucher and then deliberately sold Virgin tickets, making the airline a great success and us all quite profitable days ahead of us. I also read in a marketing magazine that very week an interview with Richard Branson, and it was followed by a very, very big survey that Marketing Magazine had done saying, shock horror, only 8% of the British public are prepared to travel on an airline called Virgin. I then the next week opened up Marketing Week magazine to see a headline letter from Richard Branson saying, "Dear Marketing Week, fantastic news. I haven't done any market research on the launch of my airline, but I've calculated that as I've only got one plane, I've got 20,000 years worth of customers." And I did think, I want to work for this person. And I joined Virgin a couple of years later, and we embarked upon this strategy of building Virgin out as a branded venture capital organisation. That's what we called it at the time. It is a unique model. Virgin is not a conglomerate. It is not a big holding company with lots of subsidiaries. These are separate businesses, separately run. The one thing, going back to our friends at Harbottle and Lewis and their legal advice to Richard way back when in those days, was that there's one company that Richard Branson owns 100% of. And that's a company that the public never sees called Virgin Enterprises, which owns the brand name. And it leases the brand name to each of the businesses. And the businesses raise largely their own finance. If it's Virgin Atlantic, it's 49% owned by Singapore Airlines. If it's Virgin Trains, one of the businesses I started, it's 49% owned by Stagecoach Group plc, which ironically now, having left Virgin, I sit on the board of Stagecoach and look after the investment partly in Virgin Trains. If it's Virgin Blue in Australia, it's quoted on the Australian stock market, and Virgin owns 25% of it. The airline in America is 25% owned for legal reasons by Richard, because they have restrictive trade practices about foreign investment, and is owned the majority by US private equity firms. And so it goes. Virgin Media, a company you'll have all come across in some way or another, which is the rival to Sky in the cable market as opposed to the satellite market, is quoted on the New York and London stock markets, and so it goes on. Different partners for different experiences, some of them trade, some of them private equity investors, some of them institutions, and some of them general stock market investors. This model was always criticised when I was working at Virgin over the first 15 years. The world of private equity didn't exist in the same way. This model now is actually being copied around the world by others. And we ourselves partly copied it from what were called Japanese keiretsus. We did a lot of research work on Mitsubishi in Japan, which is a family of companies with common ownership across them. And we thought, combine some of that model and take out the bad bits of it and combine it with a venture capital model and the disciplines of running it as if we're investing in public companies, running it as if we are acting as an investor like a fund manager would do in the city, and can we make this structure work in some way or another? And yes, we did. Things fell out of it, things didn't work, things worked better than others, but it's come to a group in 2011 which has got over $35 billion worth of turnover around the world and a lot of interesting separate investments, but a cohesiveness in the brand, its quality and value for money terms, which stands above it, because Virgin Enterprises owns that brand and can take it away from any of these businesses. Now, something happened in the late 1990s that I worked on, and it really led to the whole philosophy, I think, that Virgin works with today. We did a big bit of research in the late 1990s called the Gaia Capitalism Project. Now, Gaia theory is Professor James Lovelock's theory of the world working as a single organism. Much discredited in the 70s. Now even its critics like Richard Dawkins think it probably is the way that the planetary system works. And we called the Gaia Capitalism Project that because obviously globalization was happening and there were big issues that we could see coming and we wanted to understand what they meant. And this slide is actually nearly a decade old. And we internally decided that $100 plus oil, and by the way, we were doing this work when The Economist was predicting $5 a barrel oil. We predicted $100 plus barrel oil by the end of 2010 would be almost a permanent feature because of the peak oil issue. And also that the driving force of environmental effects on the planet of man's activities in one way or another would be an issue, whether or not it was proven. And this was not a marketing issue, this would be an industrial survival issue for a group that wanted to be in the transportation industries and wanted to be an investor in those kind of businesses. And in fact, it would affect all of its businesses if you got to $100 plus oil. Whether you're retailing, whether you're running an IT system, it is all expensive. Because IT, interestingly enough, is the biggest now single force in terms of the use of energy around the world as a single product sector. It's overtaken aviation, and it's only just behind all of shipping and transportation as a whole. So IT is now a major, major carbon producer, and that's because big server farms in California all run off coal-fired power stations. And when Swampy is sitting at Heathrow trying to stop a flight happening, deciding that he's going to protest against it, he doesn't realize that his solar-powered computer is actually using a hell of a lot of energy somewhere else in the world to send his message around the world. So it's a big issue for all of us, and it led us into the area that I'm going to be talking about today. Because what we did was, we made it part of our investment strategy to think about checks and balances in the Virgin Group. So for example, if we were going to be big in the airline industry, let's get big in the rail industry. But in the rail industry, we've got a chance to do something. We can design a product for the 21st century. So we designed a train called the Pendolino train, which some of you may have taken to Manchester or Liverpool in the past couple of years. It's a tilting train. It's built of aluminium, just like an aircraft, instead of any other train in the UK. It has electromagnetic tilt, and it puts back electricity into the overhead catenary. So they may not be the fastest trains in Europe, but the most energy efficient, and it's now the most profitable railway in Europe. This year it's going to hand back over £100 million to the government. It's the only unsubsidised railway currently of any of the major railways in the UK. One or two of the smaller commuter routes are unsubsidised, but it is also paying money back to the Exchequer and making a very healthy return for both Virgin Group and Stagecoach. We were able to design a train with our Gaia Capitalism project in mind, our balancing of businesses, our future in mind, but you couldn't do that with an aircraft. Because if any of you have worked in the aviation sector or have ever seen it, there are only two manufacturers of big aircraft, that's Airbus and Boeing. Therefore, we decided to design a plane that could fly around the world in a single tank of fuel, built entirely of a material called carbon composite, a high-altitude jet, and a man called Steve Fossett successfully flew it around the world in 2004 using less fuel per hour than a Range Rover at 50,000 feet. It was while looking at that project that the eureka moment happened. I saw this thing being built. It was under early construction. It was a tiny little spaceship being built for a man called Paul Allen, the ex-Microsoft boss, and it was to win a prize called the X Prize. And my eureka moment was basically getting out, going on the phone and going, expletive deleted, Richard, expletive deleted, he's building a effing spaceship. I can't believe it. It's the sort of thing we've talked about in the past. I think this thing looks like it could break the economic cycle of getting into space. And Richard immediately said on the phone, you've got $2 million to buy the rights to it and get the IP in the technology, and then we'll see what happens after that. And that's exactly what happened over the next few months. And the reason we were so excited is because of something I touched on earlier. We have a real problem with this. Mankind has had a real problem with this. Now, in fact, Houston, we've had a problem, of course, with the famous Apollo 13 words. And it was something that was very present in my mind on the very day when I'd phoned Richard about the spaceship. We got to a press conference a few months later, having bought the IP. And the press conference to announce Virgin Galactic's formation was on the same day that the first Pendolino from Glasgow ran. And the points failed just north of Carlisle. And the Daily Mail headline the next day was, at Euston, we've got a problem. But the problem that we've all had with this, and the problem that we've had as mankind, especially people in the IT industry, don't know they've had a problem with this, but these things these very expensive big rockets like the Saturn V or the Shuttle or the Soyuz have made getting satellites into space very expensive. It's made the access that you get to the things that you need all the time in your industry, GPS, accurate timings, all the information that comes from weather and agricultural satellites, everything that makes industry work these days is very expensive. In fact, we couldn't do without the things that are up there now. We are already industrialized in space, but we've not had an industrial revolution. We're industrialized to the extent that last year we would have had 1 billion people would have starved without space. Because the GPS system and the agricultural and weather satellites are now allowing us to produce 10% more food than we did a decade ago. And we nearly ran out of food last year. So without space, we would have done. So space is extremely important, but this is an incredibly expensive way to get there. For instance, a shuttle launch costs $1 billion a launch. That's why the US government has now retired the shuttle. They just cannot afford to keep up that pace of cost. And if somebody can find a way to access space cheaply, they can change the game entirely. Now, the Americans found a way to do it in the 1960s, and then the engineers at NASA abandoned the project. It was called the X-15. Flew into space 200 times in secret. But the materials technology wasn't right. Now, there's a lot of concentration these days on technology, and everybody thinks of technology as IT, your industry. But of course, there's another aspect of technology, which is physical technology. And we've not been very good at advancing that over the past 30 or 40 years. Basically, the aeroplanes you fly in are pretty much the same, apart from the avionics, the IT's changed in them. The engines have got better, but they're still aluminium tubes, just like the ones built to build the Comet in 1946. They had that problem with this. They built it out of metal. They didn't think about the fact that materials technology could change, so they abandoned this project and they never revisited the idea of a space plane, but we did. One of the reasons we did was my own personal experience of life, because my grandfather developed the world's first ever petrol-electric car. In 1927, it sits in the Science Museum branch in Swindon. It was the world's first petrol-electric car. It was patented, and it ran very successfully. In fact, all of London's buses became petrol-electric. But the materials technology was too expensive to make a mass-produced car, and it took 70 years for Toyota to do it with the Prius. 70 years before an idea that was patented was finally taken forward. The patent, of course, was owned by the British government by 1945 at the end of the war, and they let it lapse. Now, one of the other things that we've noticed was that our own industry had been denominated by prizes. Prizes won for things happening. Charles Lindbergh here in this picture, 1927. He flew across the Atlantic solo. He built an all-aluminium aeroplane to do it. It changed the game in aviation. That prize-winning game changer, that person, that rich person who wanted to do something special, changed the game. And that happened throughout the 1920s and 30s. The Schneider Trophy, run by the Supermarine S6, led to the Spitfire. It wasn't a government project, it was a private project. So we suddenly had a realization that this Ansari X Prize of $10 million, that this spaceship that we were just buying the rights from Paul Allen to develop into something commercial, because he didn't want to develop it commercially, he just wanted to win the prize, that this could be a game changer, and we should try and build a business plan around building a spaceship system based on this carbon composite technology. And that's exactly what we did. The financier had the idea of building the spaceship. He'd put up the $30 million that was needed to win the prize. We inherited that technology. The engineer had a vision and a dream of building a space launch system for the 21st century. He'd always wanted to do it. Burt Rutan, this man of scaled composites who you saw in the film, who is the ultimate genius, in that he does look slightly kind of, anyway, we won't say any more. Met the entrepreneur, who definitely is slightly, you know what I mean, we won't say any more. And the two of them came together and basically tasked us at Virgin Galactic, which I was made president of, with trying to build a business plan to make the construction of a spaceship system work. Now, we came across a few ideas. First of all, Virgin Group said you're not going to be allowed to do this project unless you can raise $10 million in deposits. You've talked about space tourism. And I said, yes, we've talked about space tourism, but we only see that as the first available market. We see the space tourists as like the people who went on the Stockton to Darlington Railway to pay for it in 1833, or the people who went as barnstormers and paid to go up in little aircraft after the First World War to get the idea of, regular air transport going, and the brave people who went on the first Ford Trimotors when it was quicker to go by train and safer to go by train, but they did it because they had a vision and a dream. They're the market to start with, but we want to build something that is going to be much bigger and better and do many more things and build a more robust business plan. So we want to build a very big spaceship, They said no, but get the $10 million in deposits. So we got $10 million in deposits from these very, very friendly people. These are some of the first customers. The first 100 customers put up $200,000 each. And again, in legal terms, they trusted us. They trusted our brand name, and they trusted they would get their money back if we couldn't build it. In legal terms also, they were lucky in that just as this was all happening, I went on in front of Congress, who were debating a thing called the Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act 2004, which was passed into law, which set up a legal, regulatory, and insurance framework, with the US government being the insurer of last resort for third parties above $500 million, which led to this project being able to happen. The reason we did this in America was there was enabling legislation for the first time to unlock government monopolies on space travel and allow us to build a private sector, human-carrying spaceship. Now, what those people had told us was one thing above all else, and it led to the breakthrough in this project in terms of Virgin as an investor. What do you think they said was the one thing they wanted to experience in space more than anything else? Weightlessness. That surprised me, because I'm a bit of an aviation buff, and I was always thinking about the view of the planet Earth, the thin blue ribbon of the atmosphere, the blue view of the stars. I like astronomy, so I was thinking of the stars. And actually, most of the people who worked in the space program didn't understand that what they'd ended up selling in films like Apollo 13 and moon landing pictures and seeing people bouncing over the moon like that, the thing that they'd been selling all of that time was in fact weightlessness as an idea. And weightlessness is something you can't really experience on planet Earth. The most you can get is 27 seconds of fake weightlessness in a plane that's plunging down to the Earth and you're floating around in it. But actually you're just falling at the same speed as the plane is. It's not quite the same thing. Zero gravity is something people want. So if they want zero gravity, we need to build a very big spaceship, much bigger than the one that had won the prize. Virgin would much rather we rebuilt that and took a few space tourists up and made some money. We said, no, we've got to build this. It's going to be a $500 million project, and we're going to build a big enough system to allow this to not only carry those space tourists into space, but they can carry space scientists with their experiment racks into space and lower the cost of space science dramatically, because a lot of experiments don't need to go to the International Space Station and be up there for a long time. They just need a few minutes of zero gravity, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, to work well. So we'll carry space scientists, and by the way, we're basing the carrier aircraft on our Virgin Atlantic Global Flyer that you helped pay for as part of your experiment in the aviation industry. And we're going to have a big area here. We called it in the specification to scale composites, the Linux software of space, in that this is an open architecture. I know it's not much of a crossover, but it's an open architecture, and that means we could then put anything under here. Anything that weighed 17 tons or less, and 17 tons we decided was the weight for an unmanned rocket to be able to launch a 200-kilogram satellite into space from the same system, a project that Virgin Galactic is now working on. These two hulls, this became the training hull for the spaceship. So all the customers who got the next day in that would train in this one the day before and experience zero gravity flights, learn all about all their safety equipment as the last day of their 3-day training program. And this hull is a science hull, currently rented by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, for doing high altitude carbon testing of the atmosphere. So we were building a business plan. These people had helped start it, but they were actually the trigger. They weren't going to be, in the future, the only part of this business plan. We started construction of this lightweight composite material. And let me just tell you something. I could stand, this is a 140-foot wingspan aircraft. I could stand at one end before that wing went on, and you could lift it. It was that light. It is the lightest vehicle of its size ever built in aviation history, and the most fuel efficient of its size ever built. That's the White Knight 2 carrier aircraft. Has identical hulls to the spaceship, as I was saying, so our cost of production of even the prototype was relatively lower than it could have been. This is Bert Rutan. He's 6'4", and he is sitting at the front when it was under construction to give you an idea of this space we created inside the cabin to allow both the weightlessness I was talking about for the space tourists and plenty of space for scientists and science experiments on board. And this is basically a classic business plan. What you may have thought of when you read about Virgin Galactic initially as a sort of a rich man's dream and a kind of hopeless idea which probably wouldn't come off, because people know how expensive space is. They know it's $1 billion a satellite launch for a shuttle flight. It's kind of looked pie in the sky. But actually, the things that are brilliant for a business plan are multiple streams of revenue, and I've told you about that, a first mover advantage, which is always a good thing to have, Being able to patent IP, because we could, because there was really new IP in this, which would give us value. We could develop unmanned launch vehicles, other White Knight 2 payloads for the carrier plane, and just the space tourism enough was going to give us a profit in year one of launch. The company is already holding nearly $100 million of deposits from over 600 customers, and that will give it an instant EBITDA when it starts trading. And indeed, by 2009, the team at Galactic had developed the business enough so that ABBA, the sovereign wealth fund of Abu Dhabi, was able to come in and put another $280 million into the project and become the first round investor after Virgin, or the second round investor after Virgin's initial investment in the business. And it became a very, very, very serious project very quickly. Now, what is the actual experience that the space tourist gets? Well, they get blasted into space. It's as simple as that. They're at 50,000 feet. You've done 3 days training. You're sitting in the cabin of the spaceship. The guys who are going the next day are watching you from here. You drop. Rocket motor fires. You get 3.5 G of gravity on your back. You do 3,000 miles an hour within 28 seconds. So Jeremy Clarkson, eat your heart out. You're never going to achieve that. And within 120 seconds, you're in space. Then it becomes silent, because we've designed the system with no moving parts in space, apart from one, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And that's good for science experiments as well as for the space tourist experience. You leave your seat, you experience weightlessness, you've got all those minutes of looking around, seeing the planet Earth below, doing the things that you do. Meanwhile, the spaceship changes shape in space and becomes a shuttlecock. And it overcomes the biggest problem with getting back into the Earth's atmosphere. Because the biggest problem historically in getting back into the Earth's atmosphere is that the Earth's atmosphere is like landing on a concrete runway. The shuttle, that X-15 I showed you earlier, experienced it. The shuttle obviously experiences much higher speeds. It's a big problem. It's just like landing a flying boat on water. It's like landing on concrete, and I've done that. I can tell you it is like landing on concrete when you land a flying boat. So this thing changed the game, and it turns itself into a capsule, like an original Gemini capsule, and drops back into the atmosphere. Customers are on board at 60,000 feet. It turns back into a glider, and they glide down to the runway. It's safe. It's an aviation experience. It takes the chances, statistically, of having an accident in space from 1 in 100, which is the current death rate for astronauts, to aviation levels of safety over time. And that's the important thing about it. It's an aeroplane that flies to space. And that's the way we thought of it from the start. And it was a momentous moment when the White Knight 2 was finished. I sat in the hangar most of the night crying, looking at it. Hadn't seen it for a few weeks with all the logos on and the engines actually attached and everything else. Richard arrived and just said, "It's very big, Bert." And he was right, it's very big. And this is Burton himself beside it. So you can get some idea of the scale of the carrier vehicle that we built. It started test flying very successfully. It test flew for a year before we attached the spaceship to it. We attached the spaceship. This was the first day the spaceship flew attached to it. And Richard turned up for that as well and turned to me and said, "Where's the expletive deleted logo?" And I thought, oh, God. So the next day, it flew like that. And we did test flying like that for quite a long time. And at this stage, the ABBA investment had come good, and the US government, coming back into the legal world, put an ITAR order on the project. That's an international trade and arms regulation order, and therefore we had to create a senior management, either green cards or were US citizens. So we appointed George Whitesides, the former chief of staff of NASA, as the new president and CEO of Galactic, and over a sort of 10-month period I handed over to him, and I now just consult the company. And all of that happened during this period. And this was the big day. The most important part of the test flying program was probably not the flights into space. The rocket motor was going through its final test. We hadn't attached the rocket motor yet. This was the first glide test, 50,000 feet. An individual was dropped with no motor whatsoever. He had no plan B. And he had to glide that down to the runway down in the Mojave Desert, very successfully as it turned out. And that was when really all of us knew that this project was well and truly going to make it. Here is the spaceship gliding down. This is over the Mojave Desert, and it's about to do this very glide. It's about to be dropped from a very great altitude in the New Mexico desert in 3 weeks' time. You will see it on the news because it will be covered, because the spaceport is being opened that's been built in New Mexico. That's been built by the state of New Mexico on the basis of a lease agreement that we signed. We signed a lease agreement. Again, it was kind of a bit of legal history in it, because it was an impossible project, this. The state of New Mexico was able to build a spaceport because they had federal grants dating back to the times of the atomic tests and all the mineral extraction for an industrial project that they could get US government grants for, but they needed a customer. And they needed it to be a big capital project. We wanted to build a spaceship and needed a home for it. And the New Mexico desert would be the ideal long-term home. But we didn't know if the spaceship would work. So you couldn't sign a contract with somebody who didn't know if the spaceship would work, and we didn't know if they'd managed to build the spaceport. So in the end, it was literally a handshake between the governor of New Mexico and Sir Richard, and said, you know, we will build the spaceship if you build the spaceport. We will build the spaceport if you build the spaceship. And we ended up with a contract which was basically layered with milestones. And at each milestone, either side could back out. It was the only way to take it forward. And it was a very brave decision on both sides. And ironically, the investment they've made in the spaceport is about 250 million. At the time to now, we've probably spent about 250 million on this. It'll reach about 500 million when the project goes live and commercial. But we have ended up, Virgin Galactic has a home to go to. That home is being opened officially, having now been built on October the 18th. And this will be one of the first big flights of the spaceship down to it. This is the spaceport. It's a fantastic design. It was designed by Foster's, the British architectural firm. So there's yet more British involvement in the project, despite the fact it's in New Mexico. And as I say, it opens on October the 18th. So there you have it. A project that started off with a core space tourism idea. How can we build a space launch system for the 21st century that's going to be cheap to operate for space tourists that can be used for other things? Let's start with that first market. Let's get those people on board. Let's start selling them tickets. Let's give them a guarantee they'll get their money back. Let's use this global brand name to get trust from them. And we got it. And they came in their droves. As I said, over 600 people now have signed up. And let's make sure that we use that business plan to see if we can develop these other businesses in the future. Science services, well, that's now underway. There are 3 or 4 science customers already, including NASA, who've signed a contract for suborbital space science services. The cargo, that's being able to launch satellites into space and using the White Knight 2 for other payloads. That business is just getting underway now as well, with designs being worked on for a satellite launcher in the future. And then there's the other bit. There's the dream. You know, this is a system that one day could be used to carry people around the world outside the atmosphere instead of having to use the atmosphere. It's just the very beginning of it. It's the equivalent of a Wilbur and Orville Wright relative to a 747. So it's the very early days of being used as a transportation system for people around the planet. But it's the beginning of that. And in 20 years' time, I'm absolutely convinced that we will be using the area outside the atmosphere to fly from London to Sydney in 3 hours. Because we won't be able to use the atmosphere with supersonic aircraft of a big scale. Because the atmosphere is too precious to us. There's 6.5 billion of us on the planet. We're barely feeding ourselves. We're going to 9 billion. We're going to need to industrialize in space. We're going to need to put server farms up there. Your industry's going to have to go to space in the long term. We're going to have to produce our solar power in space, because it'll be a lot more efficient than doing it down here on the ground, and then microwave it down, which is a much cheaper and easier way to do it. There's all sorts of reasons why there'll be an industrial revolution. And there's all sorts of reasons why this business could lead to lots of other businesses. Now, the theme was doing it all with less. Now, not only did we build this spaceship and get it test flying for less than the cost of a quarter of a shuttle launch, which itself was a pretty amazing achievement, but the methodology we followed was really quite unique for the modern era. This was the team that did it. There were 46 of us. That's now expanded. Obviously, George is off to the races and taking the business commercial next year. There's now, over 180 Virgin Galactic and Spaceship Company employees directly. We obviously had lots of subcontractors working for us. At one point, even during this early phase in the project, there were about 1,500 subcontractors at work on the project in one way or another. But the Virgin Galactic team was 46 of us. And we followed a set of rules pretty rigidly in the way that we went about the project, which we copied from 1946 from a man at Lockheed Martin, a man called Kelly, an engineer, who set up a thing called Skunk Works. If any of you want to Google it sometime, look up Skunk Works and Kelly's rules. They were 14 rules for doing a project And actually, quite a lot of them could apply to an IT project, which is why I mentioned them. There were 14 rules to do a project on time, to budget, and successfully. And one of which was, it was not having committees, having a president who people reported to who got the money from the customer directly. So as the people working on the project didn't have to worry about the money. You got paid, it's right the way through how to do a big industrial project successfully. And the core of it was a small team really understanding what they were doing and not doing it by committee. And I think on a day when, the NHS £12 billion IT project has just been cancelled by the government, which was started in 2002, which was probably run by the ultimate committee itself, called the Department of Health, it does make you think that actually there are a lot of projects that could go back to some of these early ways of project management in adversity. The reason that Skunk Works was set up in 1946 was because the Cold War had started. The atomic bomb had been dropped. America felt it was in crisis, and it turned to its aviation and defense companies for solutions because the Russians had got a jet fighter in the air before the Americans had. And they thought they were in a very urgent situation. And this guy, Kelly, thought, well, if we're going to do this commercially and successfully, and we're going to get there, and we're going to get there quickly, we've got to have a way to project manage which gets it out of the bureaucracy that he'd seen during the Second World War. And of course, sadly nowadays, many of Kelly's rules are long forgotten in the aerospace industry. Anyway, that's the end of the formal part. I believe it's time for Q&A now, so I'll be happy to take any questions you've got from the audience. Yes, sir?
I've got two. I'm going to wrap them up because I may not get a chance to ask the second.
You're right.
The first is, why has NASA just announced another larger V2 rocket to get people into space and not gone this way? And secondly, how do you avoid space debris?
Right, good questions, both of them. First of all, NASA is actually right that you do need to build a new technology ground-based rocket. But what they're proposing will probably be done by a company called SpaceX, which is run by Elon Musk, who developed PayPal. He came from your industry, from the IT industry. He developed PayPal and sold it to eBay. He is now running a space company called SpaceX, which is building a rocket from the ground. Now, there is sense in doing that as well, because this system has its limitations. We can build this out to create an orbiting vehicle eventually, but in the meantime, the easiest way to get to the International Space Station is the rocket from the ground. But the thing that Elon has done is he has used the materials technology approach that we're using and modern avionics systems that have come from the aerospace industry. And the Crew capsule that you saw announced that they're looking at is basically going to use a lot of private sector and new technology. So it won't be an aluminium rocket, it will be a composite rocket. And a lot more of it will be reusable. But it will still be ground-based launch because it'll take us another 10 years to get a big enough system of this type to be able to get to the International Space Station and go into full orbit. But what we can do with this system is launch orbiting satellites. So in a way, it's the beginning of a market division. You don't use a supertanker to carry fuel to a petrol station. And that's the whole point. Currently, all we've had is supertankers, and very old-fashioned supertankers at that. So we still need a supertanker, but this is going to be the next thing down. It's going to be the equivalent of the lorries and the small cargo planes and all the rest of it going alongside the big ships, if you think of going to space in that way. The second question about space debris is a very good one. But space debris is not as big a problem as people have been led to believe. It's a problem because it will become one if we don't do something about it. But you've still got statistically the same chance of hitting another piece of space debris with your rocket if you're in space as you have of driving two cars in opposite directions on opposite carriageways of the M25 for 20 years. Your chances of hitting then are still about 1 in a million. There has been a couple of impacts in the whole history of space by space debris on orbiting vehicles, and it was exacerbated a lot by the Chinese, who at 400 miles above the Earth detonated a satellite with a rocket, and basically as a demonstration of their ability to shoot down American satellites a few years ago, and that left a lot of debris behind. But the area that we're taking this project into, which is the 110 to 140 kilometre range of space on a parabola, actually is not a debris area. The debris area is predominantly around 400 kilometres, 300 miles up, and it's just below where the International Space Station is, just below the debris area. But it's an issue that they are starting to do work on at an international level. There is a satellite being designed at the moment which will be able to go into that region and sweep it and actually attract the debris towards it. Because it was a mistake made in the 70s. They didn't really think about the future enough. They thought, there'll never be a problem. But of course, we've now got 30,000 satellites up there, a much higher number than most people realise. And therefore, we do have to now guard for the future. And we've just probably caught the problem before it's too late. Next question. Yes, sir.
Sorry, thank you. Top Gear. When are you going to let them test it?
Top Gear.
And will the Stig be allowed to fly?
Will the Stig be allowed to fly it? I'm no longer running the project, but when I was running the project, we did indeed get an approach from Top Gear. And Jeremy and friends decided it would be a very good idea, but they wouldn't pay any money to go on it. Wrong answer. But there is ongoing work that the company is now doing with the BBC and others to look at projects such as, James May is extremely keen to go to space. He did a program, some of you may have seen when he went up in a U2 last year, and that was really a preemptor to him wanting to do this, and convincing Virgin Galactic it would be a good idea to work with them. So I think there is a chance things like that will happen in the future. The main thing that they'll do in terms of promotion as a profitable avenue for Galactic will be to do a worldwide media show once the project is launched commercially, to actually take 6 people from around the world and give them the chance to go to space. A kind of cross between the X factor and the Krypton factor, if you want to put it that way. And there is work going on that at the moment. Next question. Yes?
Sadly, I can't quite afford to get involved at the moment, but in 30 years' time, in today's money, how much do you think it would be to be a cost to become a space tourist?
That's a very good question. I think that it's worth saying that, as somebody who's worked on a lot of industrial and commercial consumer projects, and you look at the way that, you amortize cost, what you have to remember is that when the first people flew across the Atlantic non-stop in 1939 on the Boeing Pan Am Clipper, both the fledgling British Airways, or Imperial Airways it was still called in 1939, and Boeing and Pan Am bought a plane from Boeing called the Clipper, which was the first decent 4-engined, reliable, long-haul flying boat. And in today's money, every single ticket was over $80,000 a ticket. When I started in business, I was flying helicopters first in the North Sea for British Airways helicopters, and then got a graduate traineeship with Thomas Cook. We were selling tickets across the Atlantic in 1984 on Virgin, which had just taken up the license that Freddie Laker had lost. We were selling the tickets for £900, and that was half the price that they were going for. Today, in economy class, you can easily fly to America for £400. So the cost of this will come down. There's no doubt about it. A Sony flat screen television, only 9 years ago, was $20,000, you might remember. The same flat screen television today you can buy in Sainsbury's for 400 quid. So I believe that we can get the cost of this down considerably from where it is today. It'll take about the first 6 years of operation, get the economies of scale, get all 5 spaceships in the air, get the spaceport working very efficiently, and then the cost for a space tourist or a space scientist, or indeed later on for satellite launch, will fall. But we are looking at something that's $200,000 a ticket now, compared with an average cost of getting any astronaut into space currently of $50 million per person. You're talking about something which I think could fall to about $100,000. So depending on the exchange rate, between £60,000 and £80,000. I don't think it'll go much below that, because eventually gravity doesn't give you a discount. You can get so many economies of scale, but we're up against the forces of physics ultimately, and we've got an environmental and energy cost that we can't get below. But this is an extremely environmentally and energy efficient system, so there is room to bring the price down. Next question.
I was trying to distill from what you were saying some key features and why should it be relevant to us here. And some of the words I wrote down were trust and courage and inspiration. How much do you think they played a part in this? And if you then take it back to our relatively mundane world, how do you see that working in our kind of environment?
I think this was a pretty unique project, and remains a pretty unique project, in that it was a confluence of chance, first of all, that came together. We wanted to build a plane made out of carbon composite to show to manufacturers where Virgin as a customer wanted to go in a world that we saw changing very rapidly. If it hadn't gone to the factory, I don't think this project would have happened, because it was the physical, it was the timing of the moment. It took a lot of courage on the part of Sir Richard to overcome quite a lot of opposition within Virgin to doing it. because people did see, even inside the company, they thought, this is just crazy. But actually, there was a lot of sense in it, and it just took a long time to persuade people of that. It took dedication on the part of the team. Everybody who worked on that, we didn't work on it for money. I mean, I ended up going part-time at Virgin. I had to leave the investment committee because obviously I was compromised raising funds from them. And I went and got another job outside as well to lead the project. Most of the people who worked on it came from other parts of Virgin, didn't get pay rises to do it, wasn't much in the way of bonuses around this. This was something that everybody who worked on it really wanted to do it because they thought it was very special. Now that rarely comes about. There's really, you don't think I'm going to introduce a new version of Apple something or other and I'm going to be so dedicated to it, I'll work for nothing for Simmons & Simmons to do it. Because that's not the real world. But there are things about the way this project was managed that we could apply to any project. And almost everybody in this room, I'm sure, does project management work for new IT systems, for example. And it is all about being very, the thing about this project is interesting, and it's the thing that you should always think about when you're doing any project, especially information technology. And it's the thing that gets forgotten when you've got things like NHS projects and such like, is you've got to have a combination of a laser focus and a very broad sweep of knowledge gathering while you're doing about it all the time, and think about all the laws of unintended consequences of everything that you're doing. Now I know that sounds incredibly basic and simple, but it's not. People forget all the time. When the partner phones up and says, I want to have the capacity on my screen to be able to, download every court case that's ever happened with the keyword X in it from Y and all the rest of it. And then suddenly, the entire server is deluged because you've followed the partner's instructions. That's because it's not been thought through what the consequences of that person's request are. And when you're doing an IT system, it's a change order in it. And actually, what a project needs when you're doing it properly is you need to have the focus of knowing exactly what you want to achieve at the end, the broad sweep of thinking about all the consequences, unintended or not, and all the broad bits and pieces that could come together, and try and think of those in advance. And then, as it's going forwards, all the time, you've got to stay ahead of the client. The client being, say, your law firm, if you're doing an IP job, you've got to stay one step ahead of what they're thinking that they might need as a result of what they're seeing being developed. And if you do that, you shouldn't go much over cost or over budget on something. And that's pretty much how we did this. And I think it does apply, and it's something that I've seen in projects when there's been aircraft ordered, for example, when that focus is lost. And that's when the designer makes the mistake, who writes the specification for the wiring loom for the A380 in imperial, not in metric, or who sends it to a manufacturer in the States who interprets it in metric, not imperial. Basic mistakes get made when you don't think about the unintended consequences of everything and checking everything and not allowing committees to start deciding how things are done. Go and ask the people who are going to use it and then take a decision, present it to them and explain it to them and get a feedback on it. Don't let it rumble through. And I think that's probably one of the lessons of a project like this. Any further? Yes, sir, over there. And then one here, behind and then in front.
Just in case I should fancy a career change, how are you going about making sure you've got the right people to effectively crew?
Well, luckily I'm not having to go about that anymore because it's a difficult task. But if you're talking about the people who fly it, is that predominantly what you're talking about? People who fly it, basically we recruited one person internally at Virgin Galactic, very early days, Captain Dave Mackay. And if you Googled him, he's been interviewed a fair bit just recently. And he was the RAF's chief test pilot. He test flew almost every aircraft since the late 70s, from the Harrier through to the Joint Strike Fighter. He retired from the RAF, still flies every aircraft in the Shuttleworth collection, which is their collection of the history of the RAF. He's the only human being on Earth allowed to fly all 27 types in the Shuttleworth collection. And luckily, he'd become a Virgin Atlantic captain. So we snatched Dave. There was no recruitment process. We just went up and said, do you want to be a space pilot? He said, yippee. And he's now got his green card and is living in Mojave in a shack. But he's a very happy man. His family are living in a shack, and they're probably less happy. But at least they get to go to Los Angeles every weekend. He's our chief pilot, and he's doing the recruitment process. The test pilots currently flying it are US citizens. And there's a complexity with his ITAR regulation as to why they have to be. And One of them, Brian Binney, is originally from Scotland, actually, but he can't claim to be the first Scotsman in space. I'll hopefully be doing that. He emigrated to the States as a young man, became a US Air Force top gun, and became a test pilot, and he joined Scaled Composites. The other test pilot, Mike Melville, has just retired at the age of 67, having been a commercial test pilot since the 1950s. You know, they're very, very experienced senior pilots, because this is not an easy thing to fly when you're just testing it for the first time. It's a vehicle which the difficult part is gliding it. So the qualifications you need to be a pilot of this, if you're going to do it commercially for us, are you need to be somebody who's got fast jet experience, which almost certainly means you've been in the military. You need to have had commercial experience after that, so you need to be a captain with an airline. We almost insist on that. And you've got to be a qualified gliding instructor. We've still had 20,000 applications from around the world. So it just shows you how many people there are. You may not think they'd have all of those different things, but they've got them. Yes, there was a question here.
Touch on some of the benefits of what space could deliver us as a population. What else could space give us in the future?
The fact of the matter is that we, as a species, there is a definite truism that we like exploration. You know, our whole history of civilization is based upon going to other places. And if you think about it in 21st century terms, when those people left on, you know, the Golden Hind, or when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, Vasco da Gama, Captain James Cook, these were the equivalent of space missions. You know, it was state-of-the-art technology when they built it. It was amazing. Thousands of people would come to the dockside to see these new ships being built, which had these new things called guns on them, and you know, and had all these different pulleys and systems, and it was unbelievable that they could build this. And these people probably weren't coming back. And that's what human history's been about. We've been exploring almost continuously. And I think one of the big problems that happened in the 1980s when the Challenger disaster happened, and the school teacher was killed, the American school teacher was killed, and scientists decided to say, we don't need humans to go to space, we can do it all with robots. And suddenly that kind of dream of exploration was lost. And actually, beyond all the industrial things space can do, which I've mentioned already, you know, communications, information, power supply, server farms, all of the things that are dirty and expensive to do down here, we can put in space. They can float around the planet doing them. And we can get that back to planet Earth. But most importantly of all, I think the important thing about space in the long term is we're going to have to go somewhere else. We're going to have to find our way outside this solar system. It's just, it's almost bound to happen. Stephen Hawking said it in a BBC interview a couple of years ago. Professor Hawkins was asked why he wanted to fly on Virgin Galactic, given all the disabilities that he's got. And he said because he believed, I can't do that voice, I can try doing the voice, but he said he wanted mankind to explore the stars. And it was a certainty that mankind would. And if we started to look inwards on ourselves, that would be the end of civilization. Now, who am I to argue with the world's greatest physicist? I think that's really the main point. The main point about going to space is because it's there. You know, when President Kennedy said in 1961 about George Mallory had said when he was on Everest, why are you climbing Everest, he'd been asked. He said, because it's there. And he said, space is there and we're going to climb it. I think we lost that. We lost that in the 80s and 90s. Very much because of really the disappointment of the shuttle program. And then this belief that science and space wasn't really relevant to day-to-day life. And you know, I got asked by a lot of people at the beginning of this project, you know, what's the point of being in space? What's the point of people going to space? Well, the point of people going to space is because it's there. And because we're going to have to find other places to live in the future. If we only look in the myopia of the current world, we're not going to get very far if we try and confine our activities to this planet Earth, because we've only got 35 miles of atmosphere, and we're using that up pretty quickly as our population expands. Yes, at the back there. I can only just take one more question. I think you wanted to finish at 10:15, didn't you?
This may sound a kind of slightly harsh question, but I mean, it sounds like a fantastic project.
I like a harsh question.
But it also sounds incredibly expensive. And so from a kind of customer perspective, I'm paying £200,000 for a ticket, but how long can this kind of project go on and be sustainable when it sounds like to maximise all of the things you've been talking about is going to cost a huge amount of money? Where does the money come from? What do people who invest in the project What do they expect in terms of return, or what do they get for it?
Absolutely right. It's $200,000 a ticket. So at current exchange rates, it's about £130,000, £140,000. That's expensive, but it's affordable to a small number of people. When we did the market research, there were about 150,000 people around the world who can afford to and would want to pay for this. Now, rather like Richard was comment in 1984 about Virgin Atlantic and only 8% of the public wanting to fly on it, over 10 years, we max out at 50,000 seats over 10 years. And in the process of filling those, we get the price down to maybe £75,000, $100,000 or so. And that's just the tourist part of it. That's not the space science and the income that will bring in. And actually, when I was talking about $500 million, which is half a shuttle launch, that's what will be spent to commercial launch, roughly. And half the money has come from the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Abu Dhabi, and half the money has come from Sir Richard Branson, roughly. So I think in those terms, this is not an expensive project. It's got a highly sustainable business plan. And yeah, there's a chance it won't work. But as a piece of risk venture capital, it's actually ticking a lot of boxes, and it's ticked them one at a time. At every time we could have stopped the project. When we first built the test spaceship that went into space, we didn't pay for that, Paul Allen did. That was a tick in the box because it worked. Gearing up, the White Knight 2, we could have stopped that at various times during production of the test vehicle. We didn't. It ticked the box, ticked the box, ticked the box, ticked the box. And that's how we ran it. We'd be prepared to stop at any time. And if they turned out to be an issue in safety or something like that with this, it would be stopped. And it wouldn't be carrying space risks. It might then become a satellite launching business. And there would be a recovery of what equity you could from it. But my belief is that the team will make it work commercially as a venture. And that's important. Because if this company and SpaceX and the company that, there's a lot of dot-com entrepreneurs in the space business at the moment. I mentioned Elon Musk, who developed PayPal for eBay. Jeff Bezos of Amazon has invested a lot of money in a space project called Blue Origin. As again, a private sector venture using the same legislation. And this is the very first stage of a privatization of space. So that NASA and organizations like it go out and do the deep exploratory stuff. They build their Golden Hinds, they become the Vasco da Gamas, and they take us out to the new frontier, whereas the commercial side starts industrializing space. And you see, my belief is that has to happen. And that this project is one of several projects which will lead the way to that having to happen thing happening. And the reason it has to happen is because in 20 years there'll be 9 billion of us here, which is more people are being added in the next 25 years than existed when I was born. The population was 3 billion when I was born. You've seen it in our lifetime of 50 years double, and it's putting enormous stress, which you can see everywhere around us. It's obvious to us. We're about to add the number when I was born in the next 20 years. So we just have to do this. And this project may not work. I think it will, but if it doesn't, there'll be more, because we've got to get out there. I think that's it. I've got to wrap up. That's the end of my time. Thank you very much for your time.